All right. Well, we have everybody. So I'm going to call to order our board work session. All board members are in attendance. We have a meeting agenda. Is there any action?
To approve the agenda.
Second.
All right. Moved by Myra, second by Chris to approve the meeting agenda. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right. First item up is policy update. And this has Lisa Riggs's name on it. Lisa.
Hi, board chair and board members and Superintendent Pereira. We just have one to present to the group tonight without any marks or without much, except just wanting to share this policy with you. It has been provided by OSBA. And there was a very long conversation at the policy meeting, and a couple of things that were decided was that it would take bringing it to the full board for a discussion of what to do next. My responsibility to the board is to regularly have board policy meetings and share what OSBA's lawyers have created for policy based on updated legislature work. And that is what we presented. And when there are large changes or disagreements with the language, then I typically take it back to OSBA for language change. But this was a specific conversation around not, large changes. And not knowing how to move forward, I thought it would be best to bring it to the board to look at, and then all of us on the committee can talk about what we were working through and next steps, whether it's that we take more of a stance than just bringing it back to OSBA to have a conversation with the attorneys. Because when I do that, they say, well, these are our recommendations. We wouldn't recommend a change. Or if we have specific small changes, they say, okay, this small specific change could be managed. But I think with large things, it's going to need a larger discussion.
Okay. Policy Review Committee, can you summarize your conversation?
I'm looking at it and I'm drawing a blank on, I knew we had a long conversation about it. Some of the conversation was around the violation of the policy and what the discipline could be, including up to expulsion.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not in there, then you can't use that as a possible disciplinary action if it's not up to that point. But I know we had a long conversation about it, but I am drawing a blank on where the key areas were. So I will defer to Amanda and Robin to help jog my memory. That was so last year.
Yes, so a lot of the struggles that we had was whether this was written in a very punitive fashion. And if we are a district that is looking into more restorative justice practices, this is written in a way that was very no tolerance provided, when we know that some of these behavioral issues are part of youth development. And so just language like shall not be tolerated, references the zero tolerance laws, what we were going to do, about, within the punitive language, are we saying that these students get help? Do they go and do we refer them to counseling services and support services, and use this really as an intervention to make our students' population safer? If you have a student that is threatening violence against themselves or others or teachers, there's really a mental health crisis that is happening. And how do we use this as a way to intervene and to make our school district safer by providing more services to students rather than focusing on more punitive measures? And so that was where the conversation really was, you know, what kind of district are we? Do we want to be very punitive and say, you will be punished, or do we want to be restorative and say, how do we heal this? How do we use this as a point of intervention for our students? And how do we look at, for our victims, providing support services as well?
Okay, Amanda, did you have any?
Nothing too original off, just mostly just sounding like Robin, basically. I would prefer that disciplinary practices were secondary to restorative practices. And I feel like this this policy just kind of just jumps right into immediate disciplinary actions. Because I feel like, I don't know, depending on how old they are, what grade they're in, etc. The threat of violence can probably just be them mimicking something they heard on TV or something, and it just totally blown out of proportion. So, so yeah, I do agree with that. I would actually prefer to see most of these policies lead with restorative practices before disciplinary. So I'm just kind of curious as a board how we can make this one look.
Are there any proposals for what a restorative practice might look like in this context? So I'm seeing this is not referring to self-harm at all. This is referring to harm of other students, staff, and it sounds like property. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. So in that context,
So
what's
so there was language that we had thrown around, like, you know, the zero tolerance, you know, when we say this shall not be tolerated, you know, rather than this shall be acted upon immediately, this shall be taken seriously. You know, violations shall be subject to discipline up to and including expulsion, you know, rather than focus on, you know, students that were found, you know, violating this policy will be evaluated, receive restorative justice services. We use disciplinary action. It's like discipline, discipline, discipline. If you look throughout the way that this policy is written, it leads with discipline, rather than we can replace discipline with we will lead with the appropriate action. If disciplinary action, if expulsion, if whatever is appropriate, then those are decisions that, of course, you know, the administrators will be able to make. However, that the policy is written in that way, it's like that's what we're saying to do. And I would just like to see it be more open within the language that we use to say, you know, restorative justice, right? That we will, you know, do everything that we can do before we take the step to assist those students, before we take the step to expel them and to punish them.
And I think one of the questions that came up with it during the meeting was a little bit of a conversation about what we're already doing with restorative practices, and that was, it's, even though it's not called out in the policy, that's sort of the overriding. And I know I leaned on James a little bit for conversation about how long we've been using restorative practice, and that we don't necessarily jump right into kick that kid out and never see him again. But at the same time, we have an obligation to provide a safe environment for all students and working with students. But I think that's where, and maybe it's Mr. Cook, because James was in the meeting, but you know, how we address this, is that already part of what we do, that there's leeway in whether or not it's a first grader or a senior in high school, is a difference in what their words mean, who they intend to harm, and whether or not they can follow through on that harm. And I think that was where we kind of got bogged down in how do we keep it at a high enough level, and at the same time make sure that that leeway is available for the people who are intervening with this, which is oftentimes the principal, the teacher, the people who are nearest to the kids.
Well, and
Is there
what
an AR in this one?
Is
there an AR
Sorry.
for this policy?
Yes. There are, in fact, all of the behavior policies have been pulled and attached to the board. And this one does specifically have ARs. And then John and others can also speak, but there's a lot of paper or procedural pieces that we've covered. A lot of our MTSS work is within and we're preparing a manual around that. We do the trainings on that. We do the least restrictive processes, especially when it comes to those that might have a 504 and IEP around behavior. The concern that we were bringing up and OSBA would bring up is that by law, there are laws of a no tolerance policy around guns and other things that have to be placed, and then expulsion based on things. We talked about how even the state has made changes where it used to be expulsion for specific like drug and alcohol, and there's been adjustments to the law in that, but to take out or up to expulsion is a concern because it doesn't follow in line with the actual legal pieces that we're required to do. And yes, I think we all agree that restorative practices are necessary, are in place, may not be part of how this expulsion and suspension policy is written. However, the OSBA's overall concern would be is if it wasn't in line with the law, and anyone then would think, oh, why if there.
Well, the reason I'm asking the question is because we have policies that are high level that provide the ins and outs of all different aspects, but then the district puts the AR together, and that's what the actions that are done. And many times there's what's called consternation around the policy. We've included the AR with the policy, and on a go-forward basis, when that policy is reviewed, we also review the AR at the same time, so that way the questions that are being raised are actually addressed more in the AR. That way we still can follow legal compliance within the body of the policy. Mm-hmm. To me, that seems more of an appropriate measure for some of these things Director Stowers is discussing.
I wanted to point out like a very racist way in which we have presented our policies. So we have just gone over the All Students Belong Act. And in that act, it calls out nooses. And if that's not a threat of violence, I don't know what is. And so that policy, if you read it, it's written in a way that's more about restorative practice and restorative focus. Mm-hmm. But these are dealing with racialized hate crimes. This generic policy over here, and with that, just like racialized hate crimes, you can put a noose up, but we're going to talk to you first. We're going to see like how you're doing. We're going at last resort punish the students. And if that is the way that we are working, to interpret like threats of violence and terrorism against our students of color, and that's the language that we are using. And then this generic policy, we are going out and we're saying, oh, but you'll be disciplined, you'll be expelled, you'll be XYZ. When it is a threat of violence as well, then there's a disparity in the language that we are using. And I would like to align our language to make that more consistent, to make it more equitable, to say that, hey, all threats of violence are potential calls for help. We are working with students. These are potential learning experiences. These are interventions to help to make our district safer. And so if we are able in this other policy to use that, I think we're able in this policy as well to use the same restorative language that we use in the other policies.
I would agree with that. I think we're caught a little bit, and I did not find an AR with this one, doing a quick look, is the All Children Belong is relatively new and does not have legislative components to it, state or federal. This one does. And so as long as it still has the state and federal language that says we do have to include this, then I can see where they are different. They're created at different times. And the AR sounds more like where we need to put some focus on, but I didn't find an AR with this. So I'm not sure what the,
Well, yeah, and my apologies, because there's so, like we talked about those, like you were calling them white papers today. There's a lot of how we follow our procedures and like our manuals around different practices. And so that's where we really are leaning on how we have discussions and build up to bringing in the family and having counseling and other such things.
So like this policy, Lisa, how is it communicated, or how is it communicated to kids, to families? Because it does say that the district may enter into contracts with licensed mental health professionals and perform evaluations and seek other disciplinary options. So it does say that, but I don't see parents going into, researching policies.
No.
So how are they informed about this? What does it look like to them, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, in our handbooks, we do have to outline the rules, regulations, and what is covered, and that's done at different levels in different ways. And then, of course, it's done through our practice. And so, again, we may not have a policy, we may not have an AR, which is the administrative rule or regulation, but the practices that we put in to place are where the families do get that information.
And Myra, you've seen this. Part of it's that PBIS piece, that teaching expectations and using examples and non-examples, which is you use developmentally appropriate examples and non-examples. There are regular times, and you're talking every day or two throughout the district, where a student is making a threat or doing something, and it's handled in a proactive, hey, why'd that happen? How did this happen? Who do we need to involve? If it's student to student, you have those discussions. It doesn't come to discipline unless it's repeated, unless it's egregious, unless there are other mitigating circumstances that make it disciplinary. But you can find interactions on any playground at any day when kids are in, where you find this happening. I'm gonna do this because I'm mad at you. And you train the recess staff, you train your teaching staff how to handle that. And it is handled that way. And it's always in a developmentally appropriate, restorative manner of how do we build and how do we repair this relationship versus you're going to be in detention or you're going to do this. And your point about the policy is always where board policies are kept. That's not what parents see. That's not what teachers see. That's not how it's communicated. It's really about PBIS and how that's communicated and how you handle that.
So it seems to me that there's some alignment. There's got to be some permissive alignment, even from OSBA's legal team, that allows us to lead with restorative and just align it to our current practice. If our current practice is there already, then great, and let's just align our policy to our current practice. With that, I'm not sure. I think we're getting a certain volume of policies coming to the board because of good questions. But I think in general, if we can take this one back, if you want to see it aligned more to the All Students Belong policy, then I'd ask the committee to look at those policies side by side and see what language we can borrow, because there's non-statutory language in All Students Belong that we can supplement this with. And I'd like to put the weight of that on the policy review committee, absent of district leadership. Like,
I'm wondering if other districts have noticed that too and are discussing that too, because Robin, I think the policy committee is making a good point that how this policy might need to be revised if it's not aligned with our new policy that has been already accepted.
I believe, as Chris said, it's the difference between federal and state language, where we have a requirement to inform both victim and and perpetrator of the consequences. And that even though it's not, not everyone's going to find out what happens, right? But it's that these are the thing up to suspension and expulsion. And the other is like we don't have any of the federal language that really does specify the consequences. And from if we're just recalling that where we did approve it with the language, which is general, it's about it's about investigating where this is when this is found to be true, this happens, where the other is more, I believe, about just more general terms. So that's where I would struggle. I think coming back to the committee and asking us to put the language in that means then removing the federal and state language, which again, I know OSBA is going to have an issue with that. So
I think I understand your concerns, Lisa, and I don't want to dismiss them. I don't see removing language that is statutory as important. I think we can achieve a balance. It may not be a perfect solution, but retain the language that permits our team up to and including an expulsion can remain. Mm-hmm. But I think what I'm hearing from Robin and Amanda, and possibly a current happy middle ground until law changes, is to lead with what restorative solutions we might have for that student and family.
Mm-hmm.
I concur with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I do think All Students Belong may be a good resource.
Mm-hmm.
And Lisa, I hear you saying when it comes back to us, and I appreciate your leading our board through policy the way that you do. I am asking for this weight to fall on the board contributing members of the Policy Review Committee, them come to a packaged policy that they can provide to you. You can run it through OSBA, and then it can come back to the board. So is that okay by Chris, Robin, and Amanda? Is that okay by you? Can I ask you guys to collaborate to come to that recommended policy to then run by Lisa?
Absolutely. Thank you.
And when you guys are looking at the All Students Belong, remember that that's a guidance. It's not policy. So just keep that in mind when you're reviewing it and you're proposing new language.
Can you say that again, Myra? And didn't we approve a All Students Belong policy?
All Students Belong is it's guidance for each board to adopt their own policy.
Oh.
So they released that to us, and remember we had to adopt our policy in January, or we are in January. I don't even know what day I'm living in.
You are correct, Vice Chair Gomez. It is right now a guidance, and the districts are to adopt it into their own policies. Absolutely.
Interesting. Can we roll some of All Students Belong, some of that imagery that Robin has talked about that's intimidating to fall within this? And I don't mean we want to jump on the discipline train, but and by the way, Robin, your comments were very insightful to me, because the moment I read this, I went, oh, this is school gunman.
Yeah,
that's how I read it.
And Chair, if you don't mind me interjecting, I'm sorry.
No, please do.
There are good examples in other districts that do have the elements, the legal elements, statutory elements remain in, but also have some pretty solid language as well. I'm sure that between some of us on DLT, we can find that, and you could reference that, because Director Gomez is correct about the guidance piece too. Not that I don't like the language, I like the language coming in the guidance about All Students Belong, but it is, when it comes to requirements and statutory things, we need to strike a balance.
Yeah, looking at examples would be helpful. That's a good idea.
I think that some of the language that's in this policy, I mean, for statutory reasons needs to remain, but I'm thinking about due process, as if we had to go through a due process with a student all the way through up to including expulsion. I know hearings officers want to know that how do families know, how do students know that if they perform this behavior, that there could be disciplinary consequences. And so we have to demonstrate that it's not just in our policy, but in our student rights and responsibilities handbook. So I do agree that some of this language does need to be in that language, but we could look at, also including other pieces of some of the restorative practices that we're using as well.
Okay.
I also want to caution everyone from utilizing names of programs like a restorative justice. Doesn't mean we can't utilize the practices, but in policy, we should not have that level of language in, because it commits us to a program when we also have positive behavior intervention practices as well that we do at the elementary level, which are similar, as well as multi-tiered systems of support. So as we can utilize those in practice through our ARs, I just want to caution everyone about that language being utilized for policy.
Yeah, and I'm aware. I use it because like I'm just talking in general of like what values I'm bringing. But in general, when we're talking about changing language, like literally it was talking about we will take disciplinary action, from changing disciplinary action to a appropriate action or something similar, to say like we're not going to jump to conclusions or do this.
I just want to underscore what John shared, that I'm looking at several different policy examples around the area around student conduct and discipline. And they have things like the district and schools shall make every reasonable effort to first correct student misbehavior through family and school-based resources. And then these efforts involve analyzing individual student needs and adult responses, developing preventative and responsive interventions, and providing disciplinary and educational alternatives. So that's a way to, I think, get at what you're talking about, and that's in the neighboring school district. So there.
Yeah, Carla, what one is that? Just call it out.
It's in Portland Public.
Okay, thank you.
And it's, I can tell, I mean, they have their ARs, or their they call them ADs, their administrative directives, and their policies. And it's, I mean, they tend to be a lot longer than we like to have ours, and a lot more wordy, but it does capture what you're talking about. And I know North Clackamas also has some language like that. So I just am more familiar with where it is on PPS's website, which is why I went there, but it's not the only district that has examples that are good models for what you're talking about.
Because yeah, some of the quick ones I was finding, they haven't updated their policy since 2008, and a lot's happened since 2008, so they probably got to get their policy updated. So, okay.
Okay, then
so a question back maybe to Lisa is, this is one that we're required to have, and so we do need to kind of get moving on getting this one cleaned up relatively soon. Would that be accurate? We need to get it, because otherwise it stands as it is, and if we don't want to do that, we've already made some changes in it that we want to move forward with. So
just putting it on our next meeting should suffice.
Okay. And so Lisa, would you like Amanda and Robin and I to talk it over first before we get to the meeting, to kind of see if we can pull from this Portland Public and North Clackamas, maybe to see if we can pull out some of that language that would incorporate the function of what we're doing, like what Carla was just saying, where look at what's causing some of the behavior, but also having that aspect of it's not behavior that we tolerate. I hate that word tolerate now.
I think just because you talked about it, we want to be in compliance, and the recommendation is having sort of the additional words to talk about the resources that we use and our belief in that. I think it would be great, and then it could move forward right after our next our next smaller meeting. Yeah.
I would like to see, if at all possible, Chris, Robin, and Amanda, if you can kind of collaborate, maybe some of those policies, if it's district leadership team, superintendent, is up to you, Dr. Pereira, but if the team finds some policies that seem to fit that framework, then great, send it along to the policy review committee. But this, I would like to see like a 90%, 95% policy brought to Lisa, or brought to that policy review committee meeting, so that we can, our chances of success of actually getting it through are a lot higher if that homework's done in advance. Is that a reasonable request? Okay, let's move forward that way. Hopefully that takes a little bit off your shoulders, Lisa.
Well, thank you. I
don't know that it
appreciate
will.
that. And we're always willing to bring the ideas, and we're constantly looking at different language. Again, my major concern and what OSBA's is that adding is always something we can do. Taking specific federal and state language out is not.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So thanks. Thank you.
All right, let's move forward. Next up is an equity consultant request for information. Jordan, this has your name on it.
Yeah, thank you. So at a previous meeting, I don't want to say the last meeting, I don't remember when it was, but there was interest expressed by the board in procuring equity consultant services. And specifically an RFI was mentioned. And so I'm just bringing information to the board about Oregon procurement. And so with an RFI, it is an official document that's supposed to be used for the preparation or distribution of requests for proposals. And the only reason I mentioned that, I don't know if an RFI is exactly what the board was interested in issuing. But if we are going to do a formal procurement, I wanted to just talk through timelines and what that looks like. For the RFI, we would need to publish for at least 7 days. And then once we got that information in, we would use the information that we received for the preparation of the request for proposals. Then once the request for proposals is written and prepared, that has to be published for at least 7 days. And then we would go through the evaluation process and all that jazz. These types of services typically aren't going to cost more than $150,000 in a fiscal year, which means we don't have to follow the formal procurement process. This would be what the state of Oregon calls an intermediate procurement, likely between $10,000 and $150,000. And so we don't have to do this level of formality, but regardless of the procurement instrument used, the questions that I've posted inside the board packet are kind of the bare minimum information that staff would need to support the board's procurement of these services. And I won't read all the questions to you. I just wanted to go over process and then ask the board if a procurement is desired, then I would need either in work session for all of us to collaborate on this together, or if the board wanted to establish a subcommittee for this purpose, I would need some guidance from the board as to what the scope of work looks like, what the minimum qualifications are, what the preferred qualifications are, and then how we're going to evaluate. Because whenever we do competitive procurement, whether it's a medium or a large procurement, we do need to have a framework that we can clearly articulate to any interested parties so that they understand how the district is going about identifying the service provider and what we would consider a successful proposal. So that's the purpose of this agenda item. I did include a few examples. This is something that a lot of districts are pursuing at this time. With that in mind, just know that the market is competitive. But Reynolds sought an equity consultant. It had a very broad definition to it. I would say that that particular request for proposals was kind of similar to how our district has used CEI, where it's providing professional development in the area of equity. Salem Kaiser has recently issued 2 RFPs, one for an equity audit, which is helping them to understand in what areas their district needs to improve. And then also hosting, their district is having similar conversations to ours around what the appropriate security measures are in schools, and and specifically SROs. And so they've also issued an RFP for Student Safety and Inclusion Summit Facilitator, which, if I understood the board in that previous meeting, I think that that's probably the closest document. So maybe one we could use to get the process started in terms of issuing our own documents. But the questions that I've listed are kind of the basic questions that I would need answered to be able to effectively procure these services.
Yeah. Are there first any
This
any
is really
questions?
great work.
Go ahead, Robin.
So I was looking at it and I thought that these were great, right? I really love the audits. I love what Reynolds is doing, the training with their board, training with staff. The conversation that we had at last meeting, though, that was project-based, right? And I thought that was like more focused, a smaller scope, probably wouldn't like require a request for proposal with the limited scope of just the SRO moving forward with just that conversation. But I'm not sure, like, if I'm very supportive, if we want to go and do equity audits, or if we want an equity consultant to work with our district and board long term, I think that's a great idea. I'm not sure if this process is just needed, if the only thing we were looking at was just the SRO community engagement process. So then
Thanks, Robin. Are there any other thoughts, kind of initial thoughts to Jordan or to each other?
Yeah, so have we, I'm trying to remember back, have we had an equity audit? I don't recall if we have or not. And if we have, it would have been more than 5 years ago. And then likewise, I wasn't sure what kind of contract we currently had with CEI, was that Center for Equity and Inclusion? And if there was also work, if that was separate from the work that there was some teachers that were doing equity, extended equity training. And I was part of that for a while, and that was about 7 or 8 years ago, met monthly and did some things. And I'm not sure where that information, where the direction was coming from that. Some of it was self-directed from employees, and other times we had other material. I like what this is. I'm not sure how much time it would take. Anytime a request for information takes some time. And I wasn't quite sure. This doesn't look like it would address anything related to the SRO discussion that we had. So it kind of sounds like we went off into 2 different conversations that we've been having about activities within the district, training and the community engagement components.
Yeah,
so that's sort of my observation.
The reason that I brought forward information about the RFP process, this was really just to illustrate the technical components of it, because an RFP is something that we can do even on an intermediate procurement. We don't have to exceed 150,000 to do an RFP. I agree with both Director Stowers and Director Howitt. I don't think it's necessary for a procurement like this for us to do a fully formal procurement. And I think the timelines involved would kind of render it, by the time we identified our vendor, negotiated the contract and all that kind of stuff, because when you do a formal procurement, there's also a formal contract negotiation process you have to go through. And by the time we did all that, I think that's too late. The conversation that we're having needs to be had with some level of expediency. So I was kind of illustrating what an RFP is, because that terminology was used. But then also just wanted to share that we don't have to go to that level. However, for me to do an effective procurement I still need the minimum questions answered. Because we need to know what kind of consultants to go after. And then we need to be able to clearly articulate to the consultant what the expectations are, what we expect their services to be. You know, for example, is there going to be training for staff before we get into community forums? Are staff going to participate in forums, or will the consultant be expected to host and facilitate? And how often are we going to do that? Will it be during the day? Will it be in the evenings? Virtual? You know what I mean? Like there's a lot that we need to outline for a vendor before they can give us pricing, and for staff to be able to assess whether or not that vendor is capable and competent in that specific area. So I just need direction from the board.
So with my experience in this field with working with equity consultants around like a very like small concrete project, sometimes it's easier for us and the consultant to do the work. So the consultant sets up so many meetings, town halls, whatever, and the consultant manages it, the consultant outreach towards it. You know, staff will work with the consultants to figure out, you know, the goals, what we want. And then because the equity consultants, that is their specialty, they're really able to put together meetings, surveys, you know, outreach and engagement processes. And this is a very defined, clear project, and kind of take the lead in that with staff guidance. So that, you know, in other projects I've worked, you know, there's many equity firms in the area that can support in that work, but I don't know if anybody else has ideas or perspective.
Candidly, I think our challenge is to come to consensus on scope. I know that this arose out of the SRO conversation that we had at our last meeting. I know that there was, well, particularly Robin, I know that you were dissatisfied with the way that the engagement process had unfolded. But I know too, the district leadership team was following pretty closely the level of guidance that the board had provided to that point. So this is kind of a pivot moment. If we're to retain that SRO focus, engagement focus, then the decision in front of the board, there's just so many layers of decisions, but the decision first is, do we want to see what comes back in February when the district leadership team reports? And that's the thought exchange project. And if I've got my timelines wrong, make sure you jump in and correct me. Do we want to see that process unfold and then engage a consultant, or at least have information about what that would look like? Are we wanting to interject a consultant in the middle of this process, which does seem hasty, if that's my perspective, but very interested in hearing others? Or is this a broader conversation related to budgeting for next academic, for our next, that just the board has a scope, a broad scope of consultant consideration related to our work going forward? I think those are three buckets as representative, but there are layers of decisions that we may not totally satisfy tonight. So are there thoughts kind of related to those? Interjecting a consultant in the process underway, using a consultant to evaluate or counsel ways forward related to the SRO conversation after we get our thought exchange information out? Or is this something that we're talking about next academic year or our next budget cycle? We want to have information about what kind of services cost. I think those are three categories. If there's others, please interject them. But
Chair Peterson, if I might just add a little bit more of an explanation as to why it's come to the coming back to you in this formal process piece. I think all of you know that I try to pride ourselves on making sure that what we budget for is what we spend. And so whenever we have things that come up that were not budgeted in the previous budget cycle, I want to make sure that we have the appropriate steps to take towards that. So I know this is can be a tedious process, but again, I want to make sure that we budget. So I asked Jordan to do this so that we could have that formal process in front of the board.
This is Matt
this
here.
was something we wanted to do this year to pay for. So
Oh, sorry.
that's exactly why I asked for it. I'm sorry, Matt, I cut you
No,
off.
no, I thought you were done. I apologize. Didn't mean to interrupt. Kind of my thoughts, my initial thoughts on this is we've been talking about this over many, many meetings, and it seems like we're trying to put band-aids on everything. And I think this is a much broader concept that needs to be, more of a, I actually like the idea of the audit and do that when we have the budgets for it. And that way we get a much broader view, and then we can then drill down into that audit to make bigger, better decisions.
Yeah, my question was around similar to what Matt is talking about, the audit. That piqued my interest, and so I was going to ask Jordan, do you know how they would do an audit right now that we're not meeting in brick and mortar? And that's why I'm wondering if next year would be a better time. Like, I'm just wondering, yeah, because if we're going to do it, I want it to be something that we're going to be able to use to improve our students' experiences. So I'm just wondering. I just want to learn more about what that audit would look like.
Jordan,
Yeah, go
I
ahead,
know
Lisa.
that you want to answer, but I'd also like to speak about current national practices around auditing.
You go ahead.
Okay. Oddly enough, I'm in the process, and I did bring this up with DLT at the beginning of the year, but that seems like decades ago. The Wallace Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that really supports research, then the research field around education, has an opportunity for an audit. It's something that I have actively been looking at, and there is a possibility of being granted that opportunity, which would be an outside audit. What we're typically seeing nationally around audits is that there are about 8 branches to it, which is professional development, budget, what the budget looks like in relationships to audits, what policy looks like in relationship to equity, excuse me, practice, experiences, and so forth, even an audit around facilities and maintenance, et cetera. So there's a lot of parameters within those audits. I'm curious to see if they perhaps received a grant as well. It can be something that takes about a year and is quite detailed. So there is some hope that there may be some funding available if we look at a national funding source such as Wallace.
Is
Regarding-
Wallace who conducts the audit in that circumstance? Wallace
Well,
itself.
they have consultants in education that are usually university or based, and yes, they are the ones that publish and oversee the work of those experts.
Regarding Director Gomez's question about what Salem Kaiser is doing with this equity consultant, Section 19 of their RFP is where their kind of scope of services is outlined. And just to summarize, they're expecting research-based audit or examination of achievement inequities and areas of significant achievement differences. And then they list a few classifications of race, socioeconomic status, gender, et cetera. They expect a root cause analysis for why those areas exist. And then a determination of differences in perception between the district and stakeholders about how the district is doing in this area. And then assisting the district in identifying professional development so that the district can work to close its own gaps, and then, of course, help students close gaps. So that's a high-level summary of it, but it's a very intensive, comprehensive process.
Right. I guess I meant, what is it going to look like or maybe I don't know what an audit is, but wouldn't it require school visits?
Yeah, so Salem Kaiser, I hate to speak for them. My understanding of this procurement is that they're conducting this procurement now for the services to be provided next year. And perhaps naively, all of us are hoping that we will have students back in our buildings next year. So I think the expectation is that the services would be provided when students are back in the building, not in this virtual environment. I can verify.
I'm trying to gather some level of consensus to help the administrative team, and it could just be because of the vocal. And I'll add my name on the pile. I thought the an audit is going to also review our engagement processes, our community engagement processes, I would imagine. And although it's a delayed gratification it does give us a framework to advance from that's an independent view. And so I'm also intrigued by the idea. And if I were to camp in one of those, I would be looking at future budget cycle, understanding what kind of costs we'd be looking at for an equity audit.
Hopefully Lisa gets us a grant.
Yeah, it's still got to be budgeted though. Still got to be budget expense. Anyway, that's where I'm intrigued by that. I don't know. Is there dissenting voice than that? Otherwise, I think Jordan's walking out of this room. Catrice, do you have thoughts?
Thanks, Chair Peterson. I do not have a dissenting voice, but I think we have to put things first, and that if we're going to have an audit of anything that guides what we do, it starts with our policies. That's where we start, not with curriculum or content, because those things will be driven by what our policy awards us, as well as our standards for the state. So if we begin with this, and I'm happy to do so, we did have our curriculum. Chris, you are right. My first year here, I did ask for a curriculum audit. And although equity was not the only focus, it was part of it, if you recall, a few years ago. But if we start with an audit of this nature, I would ask that we really consider doing our policies first, because that drives what we do in practice.
Do you think that could be part of a broader scope as well? Even if it is phased, that RFI could express a phased approach. Mm-hmm. Because I know
I think that's where we start.
Okay. To play all my cards, I think I agree that it starts with policy audit. I think we also have our bargaining contracts to understand our recruitment for a diverse workforce. We have a lot of documents that have been a part of our organization for a very long time, mm-hmm. that could be what are hanging us up, and in certain respects. And so if there's some phased, and then I know the interest of disciplinary data, I do think a lot of those, I agree with you, Catrice, are downstream effects from some upstream interventions. But I think it's not a clear answer, and we're going to have to leave this meeting quickly. But I think the equity audit is probably where we want to lean with the RFI. I believe we have a standing equity committee. Does anybody automatically know they're on an equity committee, a board equity committee? Oh man.
I do know.
We do have a committee.
I don't know when my meetings are, but I know that I'm in the committee.
Well, I love committees.
I think part of like the scope of work.
Sorry. Sorry. Okay, I was asking, is that the thing where we go to the Center of Equity and Inclusion? Sorry about that. Is that part of it? Because if so, then yeah.
I don't know if that was a committee. I think those were voluntary.
Oh. Well, never mind. No, sorry.
That's where my mind went too, Amanda.
Here's what we'll do. Well, Robin, what were your thoughts?
I was just saying, like, scope of work, what we're talking about, that like through our RFI process or RFP process, like we could even have, you know, our the consultants propose certain options and what that would look like, because they are the professionals. And sometimes what I see time and time again with institutions, especially with equity RFPs, is we say exactly what they want, but then sometimes our requests aren't always very equitable. So I think it's, you know, I think the process, you know, will help us define what we want as well. But I was going to say, like, moving forward with the SROs, you know, something that I thought was very apparent, which was, you know, even stated outright, was that Thought Exchange did not have the ability to track the opinions and the responses of our most vulnerable populations. They were not able to compare, they were not able to prioritize. And, you know, based upon the comments that were made at the meeting, the tool was too limited to help with that. And so I don't know where we want to go moving forward with the SRO conversation, if we just want to postpone everything and then just focus forward on the audit. I'm perfectly fine with that. But I just wanted to make that, you know, statement that Thought Exchange is limited.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I believe I understand what you're saying. And from a practical standpoint, I personally think our best way forward is we'll look as a board at an upcoming work session, and I mean a soon work session, of establishing a committee from the board that is focused on this. It'll be it could be a seasonal committee, but that will help establish this RFI. That way we're not having a full on board conversation, but we're able to receive a proposal. If you're interested in serving on that committee, let's figure that out at a future work session, be considering it. And I'm going to look for 3 members to serve on that committee.
I nominate Robin.
Blake, we do have a committee in our district that has teachers, parents, and students, as well as district staff. So just unless
that's
you want
your committee
something separate, yes, unless you want to create something separate for just the board, but we welcome the board member.
Hey, Blake.
You're asking me to think too quickly. Yes.
So I want to get on a committee because now I'm out with the legislature and all that kind of stuff. So perhaps I could, you could tell me which one you want me to do.
So maybe Carla and Robin can join the districts committee and they can work on it together. So we have voices from our teachers and our parents also.
That would be great with me.
Yeah, what I want to be careful of, and I'm going to ask us to just talk about it at a future work session. I'm going to put it on the agenda soon. What I do want to be mindful of, and Catrice, you could help me, I don't want the board to be tasking your committee, because I think that's an inappropriate use.
Yeah, no, and I wouldn't want that either. I'm thinking more of honoring the work that the committee, that the existing committee has been doing, and then hearing what we're thinking about, and just working together on that.
I like that, Myra. Okay, that helps me. Okay, we'll get it on an agenda upcoming. I think we'll appoint a board committee that can then liaise with the existing superintendent's committee in order to, we'll
Robin,
work out that process.
Being on that committee?
I would love to be part of that committee. Thank you.
Well, let's put it on an agenda and we'll talk about it in an upcoming work session to frame this out. I know we're going to need procurement here we're going to need, from a budgetary standpoint, to know our costs here soon. So we'll get that rolling quickly. Okay. We're going to talk about attendance at NSBA. Sarah, could you send out an email to the board, an informational email? In effect, we're going to need to respond to Sarah soon. We'll also have that at an upcoming work session magically. I'll get that on agenda, but be thinking about attending an online NSBA conference. With that, I'll see you over in the other meeting. We're adjourned.